Again, everybody, this is Lee Davenport. Scott and I are here today to moderate a great call on data and COVID support. These are a series of calls we put together to talk about the ways in which communities are responding or can respond as the fallout from COVID-19, the economic spin out that happens from it is an after effect. And so we have a few slides here today to get people talking. Scott's excited to moderate, and so I'm going to turn it back to you, Scott.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. I really appreciate it. It's great to continue this series on community COVID support and different applications of technology. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about data. Data is highly important, and it's a very varied topic. So we're going to cover areas that communities are focusing on to provide benefit to their communities, specifically in the COVID crisis, to adapt to the changing scenario. I want to give since it is a broad topic, we'll provide some examples, we'll talk about some resources, and we'll bring some people from different pillars of the community, nonprofits, the city itself. I wanted to say that privacy is a hugely important topic within data, but we're not going to talk about that at length today because it's a topic that really deserves a whole discussion in and of itself. So we will probably have that in a future discussion. We're mostly going to talk about data tools and the way you can get started with data today. Hello, everybody. My name is Scott Turnbull. I'm the Director of Technology for US Ignite. My colleague with me here is Lee Davenport. He's the Director of Community Development for US Ignite. We're a nonprofit dedicated to accelerating the smart cities movement and helping communities adopt advanced technology to improve their quality of life and provide lasting economic benefit. We work with the Smart Gigabit Communities program. It's one of several initiatives here at US Ignite. It's a membership dedicated communities to growing their own technology and economic ecosystem. So we have a great panel of guests here today. They're going to talk about their data efforts as they've got started in each one of their cities. We invite you to ask them questions. So if you're looking at the Zoom interface, you should see a Q&A button. So what we would do is ask you to use that Q&A feature to queue up questions for our panel. We'll do that after we get a little bit of introduction and orientation to each one of their projects towards the end of the call. So please queue that up. Lee will be curating those questions and answering them when they come around. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us. I really appreciate it. We'll be recording this session, so that's my one last caveat. We'll be recording this session and posting it online for view on the US Ignite website. That'll include links to resources, speakers, contacts, examples mentioned here. And we invite you to visit us at us-ignite.org for this and other information about joining the Smart City Movement and our other programs. So please visit us there. We're welcome to have you, and we have a bunch of information we hope will be useful. So I'll start with my guests. We'll start with our guest from the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics in Boston, Massachusetts. I have Jacqueline Youngblood, who's the Chief of Staff there, and Michael Evans. He's a Program Director. Welcome to both of you. We really appreciate you joining on the call today. Now, Jacqueline and Michael, I talked to you a little bit before this call here, and you're engaged in a number of initiatives at the Office of Urban Mechanics and shared some examples of databases that you're using related to connecting residents to businesses that may or may not be open or restaurants that may or may not be open and the hours as they change, as well as other kind of interesting projects around finding parking for medical professionals and things like that. So could you talk a little bit about each one of those and how those got started within the context of the city itself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Scott. I'll start and then I'll hand it over to my colleague, Michael. We thought it would be helpful just to give a quick 30 seconds about the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics in the City of Boston, just to sort of frame our role in this response. And then I'll talk briefly about the transportation for medical workers piece, and Michael will talk about the small business and economic development pieces there. So the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics is the City of Boston's civic innovation civic R&D team. So we are a team of about 10 people that work across the city organization, supporting departments in imagining new ways of doing things, in spinning up small little examples of how something could look, of inspiring imagination for the future. And so you can perhaps imagine in a time like this crisis that we're in now, it's actually very helpful to have a team like ours to be able to do that sort of thinking and doing alongside our partner departments. So when Boston started responding to the crisis almost about a month ago at this point, our team was pulled in by a lot of our partners to help think about what are those first moves we need to make, what are some of those early responses we want to be able to have to this crisis. So the one that I'll talk about is related to transportation. We've also covered things like food access, and I see we have a food bank of New Jersey, which is great. Things around personal protective equipment, really spans the gamut. But I'll start with the transportation example. And I think what Michael and I are hoping to share with you all is you probably have access to the tools that can at least get the conversation started with your teams. Even if you don't have really fancy enterprise level software, there's a lot of really basic tools that are out there that can help you at least start to imagine what a response could look like in your particular scenario. So we'll start with very basic level things, and hopefully that will be helpful. So the request that we got was sort of multifold. In thinking about the medical workers who are going to the various hospitals and neighborhood health centers in the city of Boston, for many reasons, they may be switching over from using public transportation, which they previously used, to using their own cars, or running out of parking spaces at the hospital facilities because of increased shifts. And so we wanted to start to think proactively as a city, how could we offer support to them? Could we start to identify additional parking resources? And we, as the city, own a number of assets that could be repurposed, like schools, which had been shut at that point, community centers, but also thinking about some of our community partners who may have large parking available near their facilities, and maybe that's very close to a hospital. And so thinking about how do we tackle that? How do we get a sense for how many parking spaces are available next to some of our larger hospital sort of clusters. So we actually just went to Google Maps, and we went to the satellite image layer that you can get in Google Maps. And we just really basically started counting spaces near hospital and neighborhood health center facilities. Seems very simple, but when you look at a city like Boston that has a number of hospitals and healthcare institutions, and starting to look at, within a half-mile walk shed or within a quarter-mile walk shed, turns out there's a lot of parking near there, actually. And so we wanted to be able to proactively get a sense of, okay, if such and such a hospital reached out to us and needed more parking support, could we point them to a number of parking spaces nearby? And just to sort of validate that, there was a church nearby one of our hospitals that we counted. I think it was 137 spots. And about a week ago, we called them up to sort of activate that offer. And they said, in fact, we have 135 spots. So the simple satellite imagery sort of parking space counting worked pretty well. And so because we had done that work 4 weeks ago, when we started to hear that need from our hospital partners, we were able to very quickly turn all of those counts of parking spaces into a very simple map that we were able to share with healthcare workers. So that's just one example, and just thinking creatively about how to try and wrap your head around a resource like parking if you don't have access to a spreadsheet that has those numbers conveniently in there already. And the second thing I just wanted to mention about transportation before I turn it over to Michael is we have a number of shuttle service providers. So they bring folks to hospital, sort of clusters of hospitals, and they provide that shuttle service for their employees. And we wanted to think about how we could complement that service if we needed to, for physical distancing reasons or for increased capacity reasons. But there wasn't a simple way to put all of that in one map or in one place. All of those shuttle providers have their own live feeds, and that's great. Assuming that you're just an employee of one of those institutions, you only need to go to their live map, but trying to merge all of those into one layer for us to be able to wrap our heads around to start to make some decisions about how we wanted to be responsive and support those folks actually proved sort of tough. And so just wanted to say that if you're thinking about going from a CSV file or a text file, and maybe you don't have ArcGIS capacity, or you don't have an IT team that can help you sort of spin up a really robust map, there are lots of tools, and we'll share them afterwards as well. But one that we were able to use was called geocode.io, that helps take a CSV file that maybe has addresses for the stops, in this case, in our example, the stops on the shuttle routes, and actually turn those into latitude and longitude pairs, which you can then turn into a visualization on a map. And just another tip, if it's helpful, if you have a GeoJSON file, which is what geocode.io will spit out from the CSV file, you can actually just upload it onto GitHub. We were already on GitHub, so this was really easy for us, but if you just have an account on GitHub and you upload a GeoJSON file, it will automatically display it visually for you on a map. And so that may be a useful sort of interim step as you're working on getting up a full map or a full sort of visualization on some sort of enterprise software. So I'll pause there and pass it over to Michael, but look forward to answering any questions that we can at the end.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. That's very interesting. And again, we encourage everyone to ask questions of our guests. Use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom window. We'll begin to queue up questions. The moderator will begin to queue up questions once we get through the initial discussion with the panelists. So thank you very much. Michael, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about I don't hesitate to call them economic databases, economic-based databases, but it's really about engaging with local businesses, getting the hours as they shift through this COVID crisis and so forth. So could you talk a little bit about the public benefit, how that came around, and what tools you're using for that for the public?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Sorry about that.
Sure.
So one quick thing, if I could just share my screen, that might be, oh, it says I can't share my screen.
We're working the magic on the back end now to see if we can get it to work.
Okay.
We might be able to try it now. I think I'm seeing Lee nod.
Okie dokie. So I'm just gonna, okay, so if you can all see that. So, so one quick thing to just kind of add to what Jacqueline was saying. So basically, with a lot of the work that we're doing, we basically live on Slack and GitHub now. So for a lot of the work on GitHub, so a lot of times people tend to use the command line to play with GitHub, but you don't really need to do that. You can just kind of like edit the files directly here. So you know, we've been doing that a lot. So the other thing is that you can host websites on GitHub. So this is completely different than what we're talking about today. But one thing that we had here in Boston was this thing called One Boston Day. And basically we made this wheel of kindness. And basically I'll just show it to you now. And I know this is totally unrelated, but basically it just kind of, you know, encourages people to find, you know, maybe a couple kind acts that they could do in a particular day.
And maybe for Michael, for the edification of the audience, what you're talking about here is GitHub. If there's certain web development frameworks, like they're called Jekyll, you can Google them a little bit, but there's ways to offer quick and free hosting for websites off of GitHub, and that's what he's referencing here.
Right.
But turning towards the data pieces here, could you talk a little bit about sort of how you aggregated that data, what tools you use to present it, and I know these are dead simple processes, and I love to emphasize that for everybody. We have a tendency sometimes to over-engineer data projects, but getting it out in an emergency is really the top priority. So talk a little bit about how you manage that.
So basically, you know, so many of our small businesses are in crisis right now. So one thing that we had heard from our economic development department was this website called Support Columbus Eats. And basically it's a listing of all sorts of restaurants in Columbus. And there's also a form that they can fill out to sort of just let people know that they're open and what are their hours, you know, are they doing takeout, delivery, that sort of thing. And basically they asked us if we could do that for Boston. And so what we ended up doing was we used a tool called Airtable, which it's basically like this hybrid spreadsheet and database type thing. And what it lets you end up doing, and I'll just kind of scroll down here. So it lets you set up a form that, you know, any restaurant owner can just fill out, and then it automatically populates this list. And so far over 500 restaurants have submitted their information that just automatically, after an approval process, it automatically pops up on our website on the fly.
That's
so
great.
So basically we've got this like real-time list of, you know, of businesses and restaurants that are running. And so so we started out doing that for restaurants, and then, well, I don't have that webpage open, but basically there's another webpage for any sort of essential business that is open. So whether it's a grocery store or a hardware store, that kind of thing. And then, yeah.
Oops, I'm sorry. So you're using this tool to manage it, which is great. And that seems like a great public service. Over time, obviously, I think those hours are going to change or get updated or maybe modify. Do you have a way to update that data, or is there any way that you might advise, if you can't do it, is there any way you might advise that you can keep that data updated as the situation changes in each community?
So that is not quite how, so we could certainly go into the Airtable ourselves and update it, but we don't quite have a workflow quite yet for how for essentially updating that on the fly. We don't really have something where a business owner could then submit the form again and then update their previous entry, if that's what you're asking about.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, but I think that is an important thing to look into as things start to unfold, and but the last thing I just wanted to mention was that then we sort of, beyond businesses, we extended this to cultural events in the city. So basically, arts and culture was able to take what we did, and now they have basically a listing of cultural events throughout the city. So whether that's from like the Boston Symphony Orchestra or Museum of Fine Arts, they can go straight to this webpage and keep updated of things that are happening in their community.
That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. I'd like to turn a little bit to our nonprofit partners and some food banks that are working, and introduce you to Janine Fournier. She's the Vice President of Programs for the Community Food Bank of New Jersey. They fight hunger and poverty in New Jersey by assisting those in need and seeking long-term solutions. And as we all know, with unemployment rising and with more and more communities struggling with food supplies, getting people to food, especially populations in need, is of high importance. So the Food Bank of New Jersey is really at the forefront of that effort. Janine, I know you're from, I think we're familiar with the value prospective food banks, but what seems to be really new in this situation is the scale of people entering the need for food and the placement of resources and getting them to move around, and in conjunction with the data about infectivity and so forth. So could you talk a little bit about new data sources that you might be merging into existing processes and how you're managing all that, and what kind of value are you bringing forward to the community?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me today. So the impact of COVID in New Jersey has been twofold. One, pandemic-driven health impacts, and then secondly, the sharp and quick economic impact that we know that we've seen with the increase in unemployment, and largely not only impacted, I should say, by COVID, but then also due to the casino shutdown and the hospitality industries in New Jersey. So we have taken the knowledge that we have and how we work with our local community partner agencies on the ground level, and also brought in data that has been shared at the state level regarding COVID infection rates, and really tried to overlay the information so that we could see what was happening, not only from the state perspective, county level, but then really digging in and taking that quantitative data with the qualitative aspects. What were we hearing on the ground level? What were we seeing as it related to food going out, where it was needed, and then trying to just pivot and respond accordingly.
Thank you. And I know you're collecting a lot of data from the community itself. So there's a lot of stakeholders to manage. So could you talk a little bit about the tools you're using to manage that data, those data lakes, and how what you might be using to present to people?
Absolutely. So I will say right now, not getting too complex has been really the highest priority, right? We want to make sure that we are being as responsive as possible. And so managing the data flow is something that is extremely important, right? I know that the kind of saying garbage in, garbage out, right? And we want to make sure that that's not happening. So everything that we do with our partners, we have tracked in a database. We use a database called Series. And then we have literally exported information and layered in what we know is happening with COVID infection rates to just see where are we seeing gaps and how can we be responsive. The most important priority is making sure that food is able to get where it's needed. And we already knew that we were dealing with vulnerable communities prior to this. So seeing an increase of unemployment of over 200,000 in the past 3 weeks is just staggering. And knowing that we also were having communities and our pantry network, soup kitchens, those emergency feeding programs, they themselves being impacted by COVID and having to close, how could we be as responsive as possible? So taking that quantitative aspect, sometimes just doing cross-reference in Excel, to be honest, and then really making sure that we are having those qualitative stories to tell alongside that and be responsive.
Yeah, that's great. And really, hats off to all the tremendous work being done in nonprofits and government. It's really, really tremendous to see that work moving forward. Let me ask you about what data sources are you pulling from now that you're finding particularly important to get ahead of the curve?
New Jersey has done a really great job. They have a dashboard that is tracking on a daily basis the positive COVID infection rates. And then we know that there was further data that was released about specific hotspots. So those were areas where there were 100 or more positive COVID infection rates. And of those 10 New Jersey municipalities that had the highest rates, 9 fall into the communities that Community Food Bank of New Jersey serves. So we took that and then just cross-referenced and looked at where were our partners, where were the communities that we knew had higher rates of poverty, also food deserts, and just tried to layer in our service and our response in that respect. I can tell you that we have a community assistance pantry and also mobile pantries that we operate out of Southern Jersey in our Egg Harbor Township location, and demand at the on-site pantry has increased by 60%. And so just taking the data that we're also seeing and hearing from our partners when they're talking about how much they're seeing an increase in need, and then just, marrying that information together, if you will, so that we can be responsive. In March 2020, we supplied enough food for 4.8 million meals, but that was an increase of nearly 800,000 meals over this time last year. So taking the information that we have in series, taking the information that we're receiving about COVID, and just trying to figure out how we can be responsive and in new ways as well. The situation is, crisis throws everything off, even the best laid plans. And so making sure that we can pivot accordingly and just change. The data's real time, and what we know now is going to change in an hour. So. Right.
Yeah, and this is a question for Jacqueline, Michael, and Jeanine, all together. So when we look forward, right, one of the things that we're seeing in the U.S. at least is that there are a few areas that are severely impacted. The tri-state area, obviously, New York, New Jersey. Boston is not as severely impacted, but very severely impacted. We're all on lockdown. And a lot of communities know that they're perhaps only weeks behind some of these major communities in the footprint that they're going to see in their community, both from infection and from unemployment. So what is your advice for what a city that might be a few weeks away or a month away from a similar position that you're in now? What is your major advice on the things they need to be staging right now to be able to respond for this when it begins to grow in their communities? I'll start with you, Jeannie.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's right. I know it's hard to do a
Sorry, I didn't know. Yeah. So, obviously, as a food bank, my advice is make sure you're connecting with your local, your food bank. We have been coordinating very closely with all of our partners throughout the state, and biggest focus is understanding what's being done, so that with the precious resources that everybody has, you are able to make sure that you are reaching all the communities that are in need, and to the extent possible, not duplicating efforts. Also making sure that there is really good collaboration and coordination. Together we can do so much more. I know that sounds a little bit silly to say, but it is the truth. And in this scenario, again, just given the crisis and from what I've seen, people are really coming together. So understanding that you will have a conversation today, and by the time you talk, either, you know, the next day or a week later, the response may need to change. And so just being flexible to that has been really important.
That's great. Yeah, thanks. All solutions really are local. Jacqueline, I wonder if you have any insight. If you have any advice for cities, especially in government right now, about assets related to data that you think they would be well advised to begin to stage right now, or practices or resources, something you think a city needs to sort of get in place right now to be able to handle what's coming in a few weeks for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just echo what Jeannie just said about the importance of sort of keeping folks up to date on those everyday conversations that you're having, because truly things change by the hour. And so the fact that, you know, previously you might have had a once a week check-in, but probably you need to be having some sort of daily stand-up. I think not really related to data, but it has an effect. Thinking a lot about language access on the front end. So if you don't already have, in Boston, we're very fortunate that we have a really incredible team that focuses on language and communications access. But if you don't already have that in place, I would say try to think about how you could imagine doing emergency translations and interpretation, because especially in a time like this, in a crisis like this, you want to make sure that no one is left out of getting the messages that your city is sharing, whether that's a data dashboard or communications from whoever the leadership is of the organization. I think that's incredibly important. And I would also just say, sort of do an inventory of your tech tools. If it turns out that you actually have web conferencing software available to you, that's a great one to know in advance, because probably if your city staff start working from home, they're going to need access to that. So just sort of doing that inventory of what are the tools and resources that maybe folks aren't thinking about being interesting or useful, but in fact become very, very important and critical for doing that collaboration and coordination that Jeannie was talking about.
Yeah, so important. Thank you so much. Michael, any thoughts from you on advice you would give to a city looking at this down the road and what they should be doing to prepare for this data-wise right now?
So I would sort of add on to Jacqueline's point, where I think for a lot of the tools that we're using, especially tools that we didn't have experience using before, we sort of had a rule that, you know, if we could understand the product in maybe like 20 minutes or less, then that would that would be the way to go. If it took us more time, we would just be wasting too much time to get something out the door. So I think, you know, in like our presentation today, you know, basically everything that we've used, we were able to get something out really, really quickly. And, you know, I just think in the face of something that has been growing exponentially, that is one of the most critical things here.
Great. Thank you so much. So cities and nonprofits really are the tip of the spear for all of our responses, but startups are also stepping into this gap as well. And private companies are stepping in with resources and with work of their own. I want to introduce you to Mark Sussman. Mark is the CEO of R Streets. It's a mobile application that uses crowdsourcing to report and analyze dangerous driving and behavior in the city and micromobility issues. R Streets was a winner of several startup competitions hosted by US Ignite and the city of Washington, D.C. But one of the interesting things they did was they took their crowdsourcing driving application and shifted that. They pivoted very quickly to let citizens crowdsource the reporting of supply chain needs. So whether that be toilet paper or food or critical house care or medicine needs, they're allowing citizens in the community to communicate with one another about where it is, what's in supply, and how they can get to it. And so Mark, welcome. It's great to have you here. I'd encourage everybody to check out R Streets, but I wanted to ask you, Mark, how did your startup, your lean startup, how did you pivot so quickly to be able to do this with data? And do you have any advice for other startups looking to pivot that quickly?
Well, thanks, Scott. I think that I would never give any startup advice to pivot that quickly. We went from concept to release in 11 days. Yeah. And I don't know if I've slept in a few, but we basically got a call from the DC government asking if we could repurpose our infrastructure for this purpose of helping folks not have to take unnecessary trips to the store only to find empty shelves. So, and really connecting the supply chain in a way that's really meaningful right now and maybe very meaningful even months or years down the road.
Yeah.
So, I think there's a lot of uncertainty in the marketplace right now around what's going to be valuable, and coming from a transportation-based application, especially one that's kind of lenient on people going around using public transit and actually leaving their homes, and also micromobility. There's a lot of question marks around whether or not our application is going to be viable long term. And so we saw the opportunity to help. We had the resources available, even though we are fairly lean, to quickly kind of convert our app into one that's for crowdsourcing of toilet paper instead of crowdsourcing of cars blocking bike lanes. And we jumped on that opportunity, and we had 5,000 downloads of the app yesterday. We've had 30,000 in the last week and a half, and we've had about 100,000 searches and 7,000 reports of inventory across the country, and we're really gaining traction, not just here in DC where we're headquartered, but Pittsburgh, Cleveland. The mayors of Pittsburgh and San Jose just tweeted about our streets, and we're seeing huge upticks in usage in those markets. So it's the kind of thing that people are clearly needing, and we feel like if we can bridge the gap now and kind of figure out the business plan later, then we'll figure it out.
Yeah, that's great. So what I'm hearing there really is that it's the key relationship of the city reaching out to the startup, here in your case, Our Streets, and then supporting it with tweets and sort of bringing attention so that it amplifies the crowdsource effect. What can cities do right now that are really the most effective thing a city could do to engage startups to help them with this effort? What could a government do that would incentivize engagement for you?
I think it's really just giving them the idea, right? It was like almost forced customer discovery, kind of like they called me and said, we have this problem, and we said, okay, we can fix it, right? And we didn't worry about the money right now. We didn't worry about anything like that. We just said, okay, we're going to do this, and then also get out of our way, right? Because we knew that it had to be a national effort. Like, people don't shop by municipality, right? They shop where they can get the things that they need, and this was really a need not just in the DC metro area, but across the country. So I think the biggest thing that there may be some unique relationships where I would never ask the mayor of a city to tweet about my app, right? Like, that's not appropriate under normal business circumstances, but that's exactly what I'm asking every single government to do right now, because we're not charging anybody for the service. And I think other startups are doing things that are altruistic in nature, that are kind of outside, they're kind of tangential to their core competencies, but are helping in ways that are invaluable at this time, that may require some less than normal business engagements, so to speak.
That's great. And give me one or two top tools that startups can use to really be agile in this environment.
I would say just kind of,
sorry, I ambushed you with that.
Yeah, that's an ambush. I get top tools. I would say just like look at your infrastructure and see how it can be easily flexible.
Okay.
Right. Like, what can you be doing? Maybe it's totally off kilter from what you've ever done before, but it may be very similar. Like I said, it only took us a week and a half to totally reconfigure Our Streets and then build this public map like Lee's is showing us down here. And then also just really taking in volunteers, right? So we actually have only a team of 5, including myself. We have about a dozen volunteers doing engineering work and other work for us right now, because it's almost a philanthropic effort. And so really being open to taking help from other people.
That's great. Thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciate it. I encourage everyone to look up Our Streets. It really is a useful app for your community. Thank you, Mark. Next, I wanted to introduce you to Zareth Pineda. She's the CEO of Territorial Empathy, a new nonprofit design laboratory. They're working with geospatial databases to help foster non-native English speakers and resources for them. She's also an architect by training, so design is really embedded in her ethos. So Zareth, welcome here. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the interface that you're using for native Spanish language speakers to help them connect with food. And thank you so much for the Boston government's talking about the need of non-native English speakers and how diverse the country is, and we need to support all of our citizens.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I just want to start off by saying that I wish that everyone's well, safe, and healthy. I mean, it's crazy times over here, and we just want to make sure that everyone's doing well. So I'm the founder of Territorial Empathy, and what we really do is we leverage design, and we think that design is the key to solving the pressing urban issues over time, that thriving, resilient places have to address the plight of the most vulnerable residents, women, children, and displaced people. And we're made up of a team of volunteer urbanists, designers, researchers that really look at the places and people that are often overlooked. And so it's really exciting to be here with all of these wonderful people today. And so what we want to talk about is kind of what we do. And so the specific project that I'm going to talk about today started off on March 13th. We've done a lot of work with education equity. So we've done a lot of work with segregation in public schools in New York. It started off in New York. New York City has the most segregated public schools in the whole country. And so really thinking about race and equity and privilege is really important to us at Territorial Empathy. And so on March 13th was when the city government announced that they might be doing school closures. And since we've been working on those issues before, we knew that the New York City Public School District is made up of 1,000,001 students, which is crazy when you think about the magnitude. And roughly 73% of them qualify for free and reduced lunch, which means that almost 820,000 people rely on their school community for food, really. And so when this was coming up, we instinctively, and we've talked about food banks, we've talked about all these different things, but something that really got forgotten at the beginning of this crisis is the dependency on public schools to provide resources for vulnerable communities. In New York City, 73% of students rely on free and reduced lunch. That's roughly 820,000 children. And 10% of all New York City public school residents are in temporary housing. So thinking about that, it's almost 110,000 children that don't have a safe space and a safe home. Right. And so that's something that's really crazy. So when that's school,
I'm sorry to interrupt. Just we want to make sure we're keeping the time. So could we talk a little bit about the data interface itself and sort of Absolutely. The tools that you're using to help address that population? And specifically, what do you think are the most important needs of people when you're talking about language barriers and language issues?
Absolutely.
Go ahead. Yeah,
so a big part of that is that in New York in the US, we have roughly 12 million undocumented immigrants. Most of them are native Spanish speakers. They're the Latinx community.
Put together in the chat, and then Scott will obviously make this available later in case you don't find it.
Fantastic. We'll definitely make it available. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Kyle. We found Carto. We've used the Carto a little bit at US Ignite. We found it very easy, very useful. So I'd encourage you to reach out to them or energized entrepreneurs at nonprofits like Territorial Empathy and your local food banks, of course, and your local government. We're going to thank them all for joining us today. Lee, I think we might have a time for a question or two from the audience. So I'd love to turn it over to you to ask who you think appropriate for any of the specific questions that you might have.
We covered several of them in the chat window, so take a peek there. There was some question about accessibility for the grant. It seems like it's wide open, that a lot of people qualify for the COVID part from Carto. There was a question for Carto also around, and this is for panelists too, maybe Michael could jump into, are there data sets that you wish existed on these open data portals that aren't there? That's for Kyle and for Michael.
I can't answer that question very well because I'm not actually one of the grantees in the field building something for a community. So it would be disingenuous for me to give you an answer there. Yeah.
Okay, Michael?
Well, I was also hoping maybe Jacqueline could chime in here too. Okay. Jacqueline, any thoughts for some of the food transportation stuff where we needed extra data sets?
I was actually just typing an answer about publicly accessible bathrooms.
Right.
In Boston have a pretty good map of bathrooms that have public access, but as a lot of those buildings started to close, whether they were hotels or buildings that had shared office space, the public access restrooms also closed. So that might be a proactive thing to start thinking about for cities that maybe don't have that information available or have it, but it's going to change as the sort of reality in your city changes. But yeah, I think, yeah, there's many, many things to
can I just
track. Yeah, please, Erin.
Add on to that, we've been doing research around the spikes in domestic violence. The communities we served, as I mentioned, are women, children, and displaced people. And COVID-19, all of these stay-at-home orders, women are really vulnerable to domestic violence. So I think it would be really important for city governments to start releasing 911 calls, all this information real time, which is not. And one of the things that we've been doing with our network of volunteers is having them scrape information, etc., to show really what the gender inequalities are and the racial inequalities are for people that are staying at home. So Boston, I grew up in Boston. I really want to make this a call to people that are on this from city governments to really think about that layer and undocumented workers. It's different. It's hard to get information about that, different proxies, but domestic violence is something that we can tackle, and it's something that we can really address. And so I think that would be my call.
I really appreciate that. I wanted to put on that I just put up the references and resources that have been sent in by our panelists. This whole deck will be circulated, plus at least part of the recording. I also wanted to share that this is part of a series that we did a 3D webinar printing call. We had other resources that are located on our website. This is obviously not a slide that's all finished. There is a registration link for this one at the bottom. And the last thing I wanted to show is that there is a poll for the folks who are still on the poll, still on the call. We're going to do another one of these calls in a week or two. And if you are sitting at your computer and waiting for something to do, this is the thing you want to do. You want to click a button. There are just some options here. If you don't see the option that you like, use the chat window and chat it in. And we are excited to be able to, as US Ignite, as a research-oriented nonprofit based in DC, working with technology in cities, we are excited to be able to highlight themes that we can work with in communities and highlight the speakers that are doing great work and the tools that they are using to solve those challenges. And so on that note, the poll is going to run, and I'll turn it back to you, Scott.
Thank you very much. I really want to thank all of our guests today for providing insight. There's a tremendous amount of need, and I wish we could give every topic its just due, but we're trying to get around in an hour. So thank you very much for sharing your expertise with these communities. I encourage everyone to reach out to our panelists if you have questions for them, especially if you have any specific questions for the work that they're doing. We'll post that to the blog post as best we can afterwards. Again, it'll be later today, or it might be tomorrow morning. So please follow up with them. Please answer the poll that Lee put out. We will be doing these, I think, about every 2 weeks. We're talking about the topic for the next one. If you're in our Smart Gigabit Communities program, we'll be having a discussion with you about topics that you think we should be doing, especially that feature the best and brightest in the smart community movement as well. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We're going to get right up just 1 minute over. I apologize for that 1 minute, but thank you for joining us. We look forward to joining us again in 2 weeks for our next topic. Thank you, everyone.